My father's best friend my entire life was a man named Judy Weichert. And I grew up with him. And some of my very earliest memories are of the grief that surrounded him. Because when I was 2, his wife was brutally murdered. And I obviously don't remember that itself. And I don't remember ever meeting her, but I know that I did. And my sister was 5 when she was murdered, so she had more concrete memories of her, like she knew who she was. So I also very much remember the grief that my sister went through. Steve was a singer and songwriter, and like, for instance, he wrote this beautiful song called The Bride that was just about his how much he just needed Judy to come back home to keep him from going crazy, and how the grief that he experienced, was all wrapped up in this song. And I remember that we couldn't listen to it without my sister bawling. And so those are some of my very first memories. So I've always known about Judy. I've always known about her death. I was very young when I heard the details of her death, which are pretty gruesome. I mean, she was stabbed 23 times in the face, neck, and chest, and she was raped and left to die in a field. And so that kind of sticks with you when you learn those details, and you can see the effect that it has on people who you care about.
Judy Ellen Lechtenberg was born on September 15, 1950, in Ponca City, Oklahoma, a town located roughly halfway between Oklahoma City and Wichita, Kansas. Judy's father, Joseph, had grown up in Osage County and went on to serve in the U.S. Air Force during World War II. Following his service, he returned to his wife, Margaret, whom he had married just before deploying. The two permanently settled in Margaret's hometown of Ponca City, where they started a quiet life with Judy and her 3 siblings, an older sister named Joy, and 2 younger brothers named Mike and Mark. This is where Judy would grow up, attending local schools in Ponca City. Kathy Lester, one of Judy's childhood friends, would recall to News 9 reporters years later that Judy did not have any known enemies or rivals. She was seemingly friendly towards everyone. Quote, "Everybody liked her at school. She was real sweet, caring." Judy graduated from Ponca City High School in 1969, and not much is known publicly about her life post-graduation, other than the fact that she had become an avid runner and began competing in marathons throughout the region. She would also marry a total of 3 men, 2 of which were marriages that did not last long, but were indicative of her giving and loving nature. Here is Mandy, one of the 2 people you'll be hearing from today. She began looking into this story while pursuing her master's degree in criminology, and has spent months researching Judy's case.
She was married at the time. She was on her 3rd marriage. Judy was a little bit of an interesting character in that way. I think she was very much looking for love, if that makes any sense. I think she very much loved all of her husbands because just to talk to her friends, like hear her friends talk about her, she was very vivacious. She loved life. Even her sisters and her brothers said that. She loved life. She'd do anything for her parents. She was a very loving person, do anything for anyone. And, I know everybody says that about a victim, but I really heard everybody say that about her, that she was just kind of bubbly, you know what I mean? And even in pictures that you see of her, you kind of get that notion that she was just very happy and bubbly.
Judy eventually relocated to the Oklahoma City region, where she began working for the Eason Oil Company as a lease record analyst. It wasn't until the first half of the 1980s that Judy, now in her early 30s, met a man named Steve Weichert. Steve was a few years older than Judy, and he seemed to have it all. He was bright, intelligent, funny, athletic, creative, and hardworking. Steve had been a state champion in wrestling in school, had graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a degree in journalism, and had been pursuing a career in music for the past decade. He also owned a stake in a restaurant he helped manage, which helped him maintain a pretty comfortable life. This was actually where the two met, as Judy's second husband was friendly with the owners of the restaurant, Steve included. It was easy to see why Judy had fallen hard for Steve, and the two married shortly after they started dating. They tied the knot in September of 1983, and she officially took his last name, becoming Judy Weichert. Marriage seemed to suit both Judy and Steve, as the two were incredibly happy together and had built a joyous life for themselves in the northwestern corner of Oklahoma City. By all accounts, the two were incredibly happy in that first year of marriage. But in the summer of 1984, things would come to a sudden and tragic end. July 28th, 1984, started off just like any other Saturday. Judy woke up early that morning and prepared to go for a jog. She had recently competed in some marathons in the Dallas region and had even won one in nearby Edmonds. Now she was ready to continue her training regimen. Meanwhile, her husband, Steve, was less than enthused that morning, so he decided to stay in bed. Judy got dressed and prepared to step out of the door at around 7:30 to begin her 16-mile trek, stopping briefly to say goodbye to Steve. Right before she stepped out, she gave him a kiss, and he planned on seeing her again later that morning. After leaving their home, Judy set out on a rural path not too far away from the Sundance Air Park that was, at the time, under construction in the sleepy northwestern corner of OKC. She enjoyed the atmosphere offered by the quiet roads and fields of rural Oklahoma, and she often tried to avoid the popular running trails in favor of these desolate, scenic locations. Unfortunately, it was this decision that would ultimately put Judy on the path to tragedy. It was unknown just how long exactly Judy had been running when she was attacked by a man believed to be around Judy's age, in his late 20s or early 30s. That morning, Judy Weichert was viciously raped and stabbed 23 times in the face, neck, and chest. All of the stab wounds were from the front, yet, miraculously, Judy clung to life, for a time at least. Judy's attacker had left her for dead in a desolate field a short distance away from the Northwest Highway. Gathering her strength, Judy was able to crawl upwards of 50 feet to a nearby road, managing to crawl under a barbed wire fence as she suffered the extent of her wounds. There, near Sarah Road, Judy Weichert would bleed out for at least an hour as numerous cars passed by, unaware that a woman lay naked and bleeding just feet away from them. It wasn't until roughly 9:30 a.m., roughly an hour after this violent attack, that Judy's nearly lifeless body was finally discovered by a pair that had been driving by. The woman and daughter that found Judy that morning tried to get her help, with one of the two heading off to a nearby phone to call police. But it was sadly much too late. Too much time had passed. As they waited for emergency services to arrive, Judy, barely clinging to life, told one of these witnesses about the person that had attacked her. She could barely make out the words, but she told the witness that her attacker had been a white man driving a blue car, indicating that he was a stranger to her, and not anyone that she was previously familiar with. Judy Weichert had clung to life long enough to pass on these details, telling them to the first strangers she had come across, who had done their utmost to get the young woman help. Judy was rushed to the nearby Mercy Health Center. Upon her admission, she was noted as barely clinging to life, and surgeons struggled to keep her stabilized. Roughly 4 hours after being discovered, At around 1:40 p.m., 33-year-old Judy Weichert would finally succumb to her wounds, becoming the victim of an unknown killer. Here's Rachel, a family friend of Steve Weichert, Judy's husband, who, growing up, witnessed the impact of the story firsthand.
During this time, Steve had woken up and was worried that she wasn't back yet. She should have been back. And so he began driving along her usual running routes, trying to find her. The route that she ran that morning was one she hadn't run in a long time, so he didn't search it. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, and Steve was finally notified of her attack when he came back home and the police were waiting for him. He was considered a suspect at first and not allowed to see her, and she died in surgery. My dad was told by the surgeon that they just couldn't get blood in her faster than it was coming out.
Just a few days after her death, Judy's funeral was held at the Resurrection Cemetery Chapel in Oklahoma City. There, Judy was remembered by her family and other loved ones, before being buried in a quiet area of the cemetery, which wasn't too dissimilar from the silent areas she often liked to run in. Her headstone was created out of marble, and it bore the legend, "My Golden Runner." Nearby was a small memorial constructed by her husband, Steve, who had become a widower at an extremely early age. Steve Weichert was investigated by police as a possible suspect, since that's where any reasonable investigation starts, with those closest to the victim. Police often start with the victim's spouse, and in this case, the spouse was one of the last known people to see the victim alive. Steve was quickly cleared of any wrongdoing due to there being evidence ruling him out, as well as the statement from his own wife, Judy, who had given a very brief description of her attacker to an eyewitness, a description that was noticeably different than Steve himself. However, being cleared did little to ease Steve's guilt, and the questions, could I have saved her, should I have gone with her, etc., would continue to eat away at him. Steve Weichert struggled significantly in the wake of his young wife's death, whom he had been married to for less than a year. He sold his stake in the restaurant he managed, and even abandoned his career in music for a time. He told reporters with local paper The Oklahoman on the 1-year anniversary of the crime, quote, "I actually quit playing for a while. Music has always been an outlet for what I was feeling, but I guess this has all just been too hard. I've been putting my life back together for quite a while. I wouldn't say that all the pieces are back together again yet." Police in the region would continue to caution the public from jogging alone in isolated areas, making sure that these notices were tailored to women who were more likely to be victimized by these same kind of random attacks. As they began their investigation in earnest, police offered up a $5,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction, which was set to expire in October of that year, 1984, at which point they expected to have their killer in handcuffs or a prison cell. However, as police would soon learn, this case would prove much more troublesome than they expected.
I will tell you the investigation itself is very flawed. It's an interesting investigation. It's a weird thing. So when Judy was found, she was jogging, right? She had been out jogging about 7:30 that morning. She was out on Sarah Road, which, you know, you're not familiar with Oklahoma. I don't live there either, but it's incredibly desolate. Even now, there's not a lot out there. Where she was found, they call it an air park, but it's a very small airport. It was being built at the time. She left about 7:30 in the morning. She was found about 9:30 in the morning. So somewhere in that vicinity, the attack happened. She was found, depending on who you talk to, either by a man and a woman, or by the person I talked to, who was a woman and her mother. There's a witness statement from the woman and her mother. And she seemed credible. I mean, she gave me Judy's last words, and the cold case detectives said that Judy really never gave anything of any value. You know, being able to speak. She had been stabbed 23 times. Mm-hmm. So she really couldn't talk. Okay. There are no witnesses. There's no anything that you see in the media. There's a sketch of a person that they released in the newspaper. That's not from Judy. I think in one of the newspapers they said that she gave a sketch or she gave a description. That's not true. That is not from her. That is from a neighborhood canvas that someone said that they saw someone suspicious driving around in a VW Bug. That's it. And Judy said to the person that found her, he was white in a blue car. That's it. That is literally what she said.
The investigation into Judy Weichert's rape and murder was headed by the Oklahoma City Police Department, who created a task force to oversee the case, which was very unlike other crimes plaguing the area at the time. Within the first year, investigators were still receiving regular phone calls from the public. These were tips and potential leads, which, according to one police official at the time, numbered in the hundreds. Yet after a year, there were only 2 investigators continuing to work on the case at all, a far cry from the multi-member task force that had been created in the days after Judy's death. The OKC PD estimated that they had interviewed more than 1,000 persons of interest, who were either suspected of involvement or were believed to have information that may have been relevant to the case. Of these more than 1,000 POIs that were interviewed, more than 350 were interviewed under the assumption of possible involvement. Roughly 400 of these 1,000 or so POIs were people that owned faded blue Volkswagen Beetles, which police believed the killer had been driving.
A week later, the police canvassed the area to talk to people who were getting up and about on Saturday mornings around the time of Judy's attack. Someone saw a light blue Beetle and was able to give a description of the man driving it. And from that, composite sketch was made and released. The current cold case detective told me that himself. A woman a few miles away saw the sketch once it was released in the paper and remembered seeing him in a light blue Bug at an intersection near her house, which was also very close to Judy's house as well at the time. It would have been very close in time to her death, either right before or right after. She called the police and left a message, and no one ever called her back. She ended up contacting me last year because the case has always bugged her, and she randomly decided to look up to see if anything had happened in it, and she found the page and contacted me. I was able to get her in contact with the cold case detective, and it's the first time she's ever been interviewed.
At the end of this year-long investigation, police only had a handful of individuals who fit the suspect criteria and who warranted further scrutiny. After being raped and stabbed 23 times, Judy Weichert had been able to survive long enough to pass on a brief description of her attacker. An attacker that was unknown to her, who was a white man in a blue vehicle. Police would take this information and use it to inform their following actions, including an extensive canvass throughout the surrounding area. From this canvass, they learned about a suspicious man that had been seen in the area on the day that Judy Weichert was murdered. This was a white male with a large nose, in his late 20s to early 30s, who stood between 5'10" and 6 feet, had a slender build with muscular arms, and had long, wavy, dirty blonde hair with a scraggly beard. He was believed to have been driving a faded blue Volkswagen Bug and had a circular tattoo on his upper left shoulder. This individual had also been seen in this northwest corner of Oklahoma City on the day in question, July 28, 1984. The actual offender that had raped and murdered Judy had left behind physical evidence of himself at the crime scene. Testing at the time revealed that this killer had a rare blood type that was found in less than 1% of all males, and it was believed by investigators that this could ultimately be the linchpin for the case. But that day has yet to pass. Several months after Judy Weichert's murder, in the spring of 1985, investigators with the OKC PD reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit to help draw up a psychological profile of this unknown culprit. This, they believed, would help them narrow in on some specific information that could aid them in their hunt. Information such as the killer's approximate age, his social and educational background, his possible mindset, etc. This was the first psychological profile sought out by police in Oklahoma City, serving as a tragic milestone in Oklahoma's criminal justice history. It was widely theorized at the time that this might not have been the killer's first crime, possibly not even his most recent. As months continued to pass, investigators began to expand their scope into the surrounding area, eventually coming out into other states and time zones. It was then learned that similar crimes had been committed in other areas of the US, namely in Pomona, California, Las Vegas, Nevada, and in Fairfax County, Virginia, on the other side of the country entirely. In these 3 incidents, the victims had been women that were out jogging in somewhat isolated terrain, who had been abducted, raped, and then stabbed. 2 out of the 3 had died as a result of the injuries sustained in these attacks, but the victim in Fairfax County, Virginia had survived. Evidence found at that crime scene indicated that the attacker had brown hair, not blonde hair, which fit in with the surviving victim's description. Small details like that made it hard for police to agree upon whether these crimes could be related or not, and ultimately fed into a lot of conflicting reports. This series of likely unrelated crimes was being investigated by the FBI, which ultimately ended up delaying the creation of the psychological profile in the Judy Weichert case, which ultimately might have put a hamper on the overall investigation. As the case began to stagnate within its first year, police officials began to siphon off members of the task force to other investigations deemed more pressing, while people with possible information began to lose track of detail. Within months, the calls had stopped coming in, and public interest in the case was nearly depleted. However, Judy Weichert's case would begin to attract some more attention the following year, 1986, when it was linked by officials to another similar crime, which had unfolded just a short distance away from where her body had been found. We're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. On Wednesday, May 8th, 1985, less than a year after Judy Weichert's violent death, a woman was returning home from work during her lunch break. As she stepped into her Woodlake apartment in the northwest corner of Oklahoma City, she seems to have interrupted a burglary in progress. The thief, who had brought a knife along with him, quickly overpowered this young woman, stabbing her in the arm with what police later theorized was a meat fork. He then subjected the woman to a brutal rape, pushing her to the floor and holding a pillow over her face. Throughout the ordeal, he threatened to kill her if she fought back or even looked at him. Thankfully, this young woman would survive this ordeal, but was horribly shaken afterwards as she reported the incident to police. In the months that followed, she would struggle to return to some kind of normalcy as police investigated the incident, which they believed might be related to other crimes from nearby. In particular, the still unsolved rape and murder of nearby jogger Judy Weichert. Oklahoma City police detectives began investigating and set out to learn more about those that lived or worked in the area. In this search, they eventually came upon a young man named Jeffrey Todd Pierce, who had been working at this woman's apartment complex as part of a landscaping crew. Jeff Pierce was a 24-year-old that had recently married the mother of his twin sons, who were just infants at the time of this attack. In an ironic twist, the birthday of his wife was May 8th, the same day this assault had taken place. Despite police liking him as a suspect, he was not originally believed to have committed the crime. He did not really match the physical description given to police by the victim, and later, when he was inserted into a photo lineup, he was not identified by the victim. Police did not really have any evidence against him, but for whatever reason, they remained incredibly suspicious and still liked him for this brutal rape. Despite him having no criminal record and multiple alibi witnesses verifying his presence on the day of the attack. Many months later, police would include Jeffrey Pierce's photo in yet another police lineup. This time though, he was wearing a tan t-shirt, which is what the rapist had been wearing as described by the victim in her original police report. This time, the victim picked out Jeff Pierce from the photo lineup, giving police the go-ahead to continue their investigation into him. They were then able to obtain physical evidence from Pierce himself, which included hair and blood samples. These were samples that Pierce gave willingly, believing that they would clear his name. Yet, Pierce later stated that it did the exact opposite. In an interview with CBS News years later, he recalled, quote, "I voluntarily gave them hairs and blood, and they said if this comes back and it doesn't match, you can go home. And I voluntarily gave it to them, and they came back 5 minutes later and said, oh, it all matches, you're going to prison." According to investigators, the hair follicles provided from Jeffrey Pierce seemed to be consistent with hair left behind by the rapist in the May 1985 attack. Although, as we'll get to, this evidence was less than concrete. Most intriguingly though, testing of Pierce's blood revealed that he had an incredibly rare blood type. So rare that it was prevalent in less than 1% of the male population. Police believed that Jeffrey Pierce could have not only committed the burglary and rape in May of 1985, but might have even been behind the rape and murder of Judy Weichert from the year prior. Not only did he have the same blood type as the perpetrator in that attack, but he also seemed to match the physical characteristics described by multiple witnesses in the vicinity of the Weichert crime scene. He stood approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed approximately 170 pounds with a slender build, had a large nose, and at the time had long wavy blonde hair. A search of Jeffrey Pierce's home then yielded a knife that police stated was consistent with the knife that had been used to kill Judy Weichert. It appeared similar in size and shape, and was theorized to have been the murder weapon. By all indications, Jeffrey Pierce seemed to be the guy that police had been looking for in both of these unsolved cases. On March 1st, 1986, almost 1 year after the interrupted burglary/rape and nearly 2 years after Judy Weichert's murder, Pierce was arrested at his home. However, he was only charged in one of the two cases, the 1985 rape, in which the victim had survived. It was not believed that police had enough evidence to charge him with Judy Weichert's murder, and that would not change anytime soon. Jeff Pierce would soon stand trial for the rape and burglary of the woman in Oklahoma City. During the trial, police were allowed to speak pretty openly about their ongoing investigation into Judy Weichert's rape and murder, which Pierce was the primary suspect in. But the crux of the state's case relied upon the testimony of forensic expert Joyce Gilchrist. Gilchrist would become a pretty prominent figure in this story, as she was a forensic chemist working in Oklahoma City at the time, who was often relied upon to provide expert testimony in criminal proceedings. She had even earned herself a nickname in the department, Black Magic, for her ability to match DNA evidence to almost anybody charged with a crime. She was even noted by several journalists for her innate ability to persuade juries, explaining the science in layman's terms that, more often than not, resulted in the charged parties being convicted. In the trial to determine Jeffrey Pierce's innocence or guilt, Gilchrist testified to the fact that the defendant's hair samples were quote-unquote microscopically consistent with hairs found at both crime scenes. Not only the 1985 rape he was charged with, but also Judy Weichert's rape and murder. These hairs, she contested, shared unique characteristics with Pierce's hair follicles. Despite us knowing now, decades later, that this type of testing is less than 100% accurate, Joyce Gilchrist testified that it assuredly was. With the testimony of Joyce Gilchrist, prosecutors were able to overcome Jeffrey Pierce's defense. which contested that he had no criminal record and even had an alibi for the date in question, May 8th, 1985. That had been his wife's birthday, and during his lunch break, which happened to coincide with the time period that the burglary and rape took place, he had gone out to lunch with 2 coworkers who testified on his behalf. Additionally, he even testified that he had purchased a birthday present for his wife during this time period, diamond earrings, which he gave to her later that night. This wasn't enough, though. In the fall of 1986, Jeffrey Todd Pierce was convicted in the 1985 rape case, and in December of that year, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison, which was the maximum possible sentence allowed under law. To Jeffrey, this was a death sentence in all but name, as it would keep him incarcerated until he was roughly 90 years old. Even if he were to be released early, police seemed poised to charge him in the Judy Weichert case, claiming that now, after his conviction for a similar crime in the same region, they had enough evidence to charge him with Judy's rape and murder. Yet, they never did. Over the next several years, investigators and prosecutors never pressed this issue. They refused to move forward with any kind of prosecution in the Judy Weichert case, seeming to leave this threat open-ended, just in case Jeffrey Pierce thought about appealing his conviction or applying for early release. It seems now like investigators considered the matter settled, because they stopped actively investigating the Judy Weichert case altogether. According to them, the case was closed, and they unofficially labeled Jeffrey Pierce as Judy's killer, despite never even bringing charges against him. For more than a decade, our story, Judy's story, entered a black hole of media coverage. There was no one investigating her crime, and no one really willing to talk about her case. No one willing to discuss whether or not police had ever got the right guy. It wasn't until 2001 that this story received any kind of update at all. Joyce Gilchrist worked for the Oklahoma City Police Department for over 20 years, beginning in the early 1980s as a forensic chemist. She entered the department having undergone training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, as well as a highly esteemed research institute in Emeryville, California. By the middle of the decade, she had already made a name for herself, black magic, and had become a constant presence in courtrooms. She was relied upon by the OKC PD to convince jurors of defendants' guilt, providing testimony in over 3,000 criminal trials. Here, she identified suspects with hair, blood, and/or carpet fibers taken from crime scenes, and was unusually effective at finding forensic traits that her colleagues had somehow missed. Joyce Gilchrist quickly climbed the ranks of her department, and was instrumental in the prosecution against Jeffrey Pierce. In the early 1990s, she ascended from being a simple forensic chemist to being department supervisor, an upward move that would eventually begin to unravel secrets about her career in the OKC PD. You see, this time period was noted for having some pretty significant advancements in DNA testing, which provided changes and upheavals to the older system of forensic testing. Those that had been keeping up with the latest scientific methods were not really affected by the changes, but those that hadn't been, such as Joyce Gilchrist, were directly impacted. After learning that her testimony had been less than truthful in at least a handful of court cases, the FBI began reviewing some cases that Gilchrist had contributed to. They would later note that in 5 out of the 8 cases they reviewed, she had, according to the New York Times, quote, misidentified evidence or given improper courtroom testimony. The FBI itself would later conclude that Joyce Gilchrist had given testimony, quote, that went beyond the acceptable limits of forensic science. Basically, she had testified to things she shouldn't have, and had made direct implications in an untold number of criminal cases that were not backed up by any actual evidence. And that was just her work as a forensic chemist from over a decade prior. Her decade as a supervisor was marred by a number of other issues, such as the failure to maintain certain standards and the wholesale destruction of valuable evidence. Jeffrey Pierce, who had once been on the receiving end of this expert testimony, had served nearly a quarter of his 65-year sentence at this point. He had already given up hope of ever being a free man again and was resigned to spending the rest of his days in an Oklahoma State correctional facility. Fortunately, Pierce's case was one of those reviewed by the FBI. They began looking into the interrupted burglary and rape case that Jeff Pierce had been convicted of, and decided to use modern-day forensic testing to compare his DNA to evidence that had been left behind by the true perpetrator. The FBI found that none of the evidence matched up. Not the hair follicles that Joyce Gilchrist had once testified to proving Pierce's guilt, nor the blood or semen left at the crime scene. In fact, none of this evidence would match Jeffrey Pierce. As far as the Bureau was concerned, Jeffrey Pierce was 100% innocent. This revelation led to an immediate backlash against Joyce Gilchrist, who at this time was still one of the OKC PD's most trusted experts and police officials. She was still being relied upon to provide testimony, and like I said, had weighed in on over 3,000 criminal cases. This included 23 capital cases, in which 12 inmates were awaiting execution on death row. 11 had already been executed by the state. Joyce Gilchrist was suspended as the state began an immediate review of every case she had been a part of, and the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the OSBI, began an investigation of their own which was working in tandem with the FBI's investigation. Eventually, Gilchrist was dismissed from her position and ultimately shunned from the forensic community for what had been years of systematic dysfunction in the lab she supervised, as well as a total disregard for fact or justice spanning her entire professional career. Despite that, though, she would never be charged with obstruction of justice or any other crimes. For all of the cases she had bungled with her false testimony, she was allowed to live out the rest of her days in peaceful exile, never confessing to any mistakes which were proven multiple times in wrongful conviction appeals and lawsuits. Jeffrey Pierce was released from custody in May of 2001, less than a week after reports were published in national publications about the Joyce Gilchrist scandal. He had been 24 years old when he went to prison, convicted of a burglary and rape he had no part of, and was now nearly 40. Roughly half of his life had gone by, and he had to start over from the ground floor. Pierce was able to reunite with his ex-wife, who had divorced him and moved away from Oklahoma after his conviction, a decision she now regretted, believing that she had abandoned her husband in his time of need. However, she had done so in an effort to shield their 2 children, 2 sons who were just about a year old at the time of Jeffrey's arrest. They were now 15, and had not had any kind of relationship with their father, those years wiped away due to a wrongful conviction. Pierce would eventually file a $75 million lawsuit against Oklahoma City, alleging that Joyce Gilchrist and then District Attorney Bob Meesey had conspired to produce false evidence against him. This suit was settled a handful of years later, in 2007, with the city agreeing to pay Pierce $4 million, all of which was taken from public funds to cover up this horrendous injustice. It was believed at the time that Pierce could have pressed for more, but both he and the state were happy to put this matter behind them. After all, this settlement allowed the state to avoid admitting any liability, so it was money well spent for them. This resolution was a victory for human rights and the overall criminal justice system, but it still left the open-ended question of who had committed these crimes.
I mean, you can't Google Judy without coming up with Jeffrey Todd Pierce. And it's kind of a crazy thing that, number one, that the cases were ended up being connected, honestly, because what had ended up happening is that, Judy was killed in 1984, and then over a year later, another woman was raped. And Jeffrey Todd Pierce had the unfortunate event of being the landscaper of the apartment building where that woman was raped. And they just kind of decided that it was him. And it really snowballed from there, which is honestly really, if I'm going to be honest, why Judy's case is still cold. they decided it was him. They went with that, and that's kind of where it stayed. When we started looking at it and Judy's brother was talked to, he was really kind of shocked to find out that Jeffrey Todd Pierce wasn't the guy. And, you know, his DNA was run in 2001, I believe, saying, you know, this isn't the guy. He's unequivocally not the guy. And nobody told them that he wasn't the guy. So, you know, it's shocking and sad. It really is. And it's not just Judy that got caught up in it.
Following the release of Jeffrey Pierce from prison, it became apparent that the real culprits of these two crimes could still be out there, having escaped culpability for the better part of 2 decades. After all, police had convicted Pierce in the unrelated 1985 rape case, but had never brought charges against him for the rape and murder of Judy Weichert. Now, the reason why had become apparent. Cold case investigators set out to determine who had committed these crimes, starting with the 1985 burglary and rape that Pierce had been proven innocent of. Using federal and state DNA databases, they compared evidence left behind by the true culprit to a wealth of potential matches, and ultimately found one. It was a man who had previously committed similar attacks in the region, and who had been arrested numerous times in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The police did not want to publicly name this suspect in the press, but it was believed to be a 41-year-old from Oklahoma City, who was then serving a 45-year sentence for rape and burglary, having been convicted in 1998. Unfortunately, due to Oklahoma's statute of limitations, it was impossible for the state to bring charges against this guy for the 1985 rape. You see, Oklahoma's laws required rape charges to be brought within 7 years of the offense, meaning that the perpetrator would have needed to be charged by 1992, roughly a decade prior to this revelation. The suspect in that case has since been released, serving only 16 years out of his 45-year sentence. He is now a registered sex offender living in Lansing, Michigan, where he is, for all intents and purposes, a free man. Despite being the likely perpetrator in the 1985 burglary and rape case, he can never be charged with that crime because of Oklahoma's horribly outdated sex offense laws. So, where does that leave us in the Judy Weichert case? Unfortunately, it seems like we are in the same spot investigators were decades ago when this case first started to unfold. The suspect in the 1985 rape case seems to fit most of the physical descriptions of Judy's killer. He was around 30 at the time of the attack, stood 6'3" with a slender build, and had a tattoo on his upper left arm. He lived in the region and committed a number of similar crimes. Yet, he is not believed to have been involved in Judy Weichert's murder. At the time, he was serving a prison sentence for another crime, and DNA left behind by the killer does not match up with him. Between 1985 and 2002, police had been operating under the assumption that Judy's killer and the perpetrator of the 1985 rape had been one and the same, and throughout all of those years, they had just been wrong. They gave up on Judy's case because of this misguided assumption, choosing not to press their case against Jeffrey Pierce because they knew they did not have enough evidence. Yet, they chose not to investigate or probe any further, leaving Judy and her loved ones in a place where answers have faded and justice is uncertain. Decades have now passed since Jeffrey Pierce's conviction was overturned and he became a free man. Yet, police seem to have made no progress whatsoever in Judy's case, with it being handed off to Oklahoma City's cold case detectives long ago. However, it is unlikely to see an update of any kind in the near future, as detectives are not actively investigating the case.
They're not doing anything with it. Oklahoma City Police Department has a cold case detective, and technically he works for the district attorney's office. He is a retired detective from Oklahoma City Police Department. He retired and then he went back to work for cold cases. And just to kind of break things down for you a bit, Oklahoma City has somewhere in the neighborhood between 500 to 600 cold cases. Going back the 50s, the 60s. And when a case goes cold, eventually you just kind of wait for a tip to come in. It's not getting actively worked unless there's something to actively work, and there's not anything to actively work with Judy's case anymore. And at this point, either everyone is deceased or everyone is approaching that mark because it's been 35 years. So they're not really doing anything with it because there's nothing to be done. You know, until someone calls and says, either I did it or I know who did it, there's nothing to be done, unfortunately.
Yeah, unless they had DNA, unless they could definitively match DNA. And then it's, well, your crime lab was completely messed up. How do we even know that this is the DNA from the kid, you know? Who knows? It might be impossible to actually convict someone on now because of it.
Decades have gone by without any resolution in this case. Many of Judy's loved ones have since passed away, including both of her parents, Joseph and Margaret, who passed away in 2018 and 2015, respectively. Judy's husband, Steve, who was left widowed and bereaved after her sudden passing, struggled to find his way in life for some time afterwards. He was eventually able to rekindle his passion for music, releasing a couple of independent albums. Steve Weichert remarried in 2000, being able to spend his last years in peace and happiness. Unfortunately, he too passed away in 2013 due to complications from cancer. Right now you're actually listening to one of the last songs he ever wrote, which friends believe was about Judy and his lifelong struggle to overcome her tragic loss. Judy's siblings and many of her friends continue to keep her life and legacy alive today, but they too are eagerly awaiting any kind of development in this case. Information is still being sought by Oklahoma police, who have recently decided to include Judy in their cold case playing cards, which are distributed to inmates throughout Oklahoma in an effort to garner leads. If you, or anyone you know, may have information about this case, you are encouraged to reach out to the OSBI by calling 800-522-8017 or emailing in to tips@osbi.ok.gov. This information can also be sent in anonymously to Oklahoma City Crime Stoppers at 405-235-7300. More than 35 years have passed since Judy Weichert was raped and murdered, yet her surviving loved ones remain hopeful that answers can be found. Until such a time, her story remains unresolved.
Take your worst disaster and bring it home to a soul that answers deep in the heart of everyone. For right in the middle, right in the middle of your broken heart, there is peace.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I would like to thank both Rachel Smith and Mandy Newland Davis, who were both kind enough to chat with me about Judy's story and her still unsolved case. They've both been super helpful and informative, and have both spent time moderating a Facebook page about Judy's case. If you want to stay up to date on any updates in this story, make sure to find it by searching for Her Last Run, the Judy Weichert murder, on Facebook. I would also like to thank Steve Weichert's widow, Andrea, for allowing me to use Steve's music in this episode. You can stay updated about this podcast by searching for Unresolved on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And you could also find the podcast website at unresolved.me. There we have an email contact form, as well as any information you may need. I'm still kinda trying to catch up after my most recent move, which has taken my wife and I from the swampy, humid air of Augusta, Georgia, to the swampy, humid air of Washington, D.C. It's been a chaotic month, so if I haven't responded to your emails or messages, just please be patient. I'm way behind in everything, but I promise I will get back to you soon. If you would like to help support this show and even hear some bonus exclusive content, please make sure to check out patreon.com/unresolvedpod. You can also find it by just searching for Unresolved on Patreon, but there you could get access to a bunch of perks, including early commercial-free access to each episode, bonus Unresolved mini-episodes, and my new monthly show, Resolved, which takes a look at solved cases that have already worked their way through the criminal justice system. I just recently released an episode about the 4chan killer himself, David Kalick, and have another story in the works for this month, which I'm sure will rile up some of you, as it goes over the shooting death of Philando Castile. Before I go, I would like to thank the producers of Unresolved, who help support the show each month through Patreon. These producers are Maggyjames, Ben Krokum, Roberta Janson, Matthew Brock, Quil Carter, Peggy Belarde, Evan White, Laura Hannan, Astrid Kneier, Katherine Vatalaro, Damion Moore, Amy Hampton Miller, Scott Meesey, Stephen Wilson, Scott Patzold, Kathy Marie, Marie Vanglund, Lori Rodriguez, Emily McMehen, Jessica Yount, Brian Rollins, and Allie Ibarra. I would also like to thank everyone else for simply listening. I hope you all are ready to embark on another wild season of Unresolved. Without dragging this outro out any longer than it needs to, I am very excited for what I have planned for this season, as this show is finally close to becoming what I've always envisioned. Thank you all for coming along for the ride. Until next time, everyone, stay safe, and I will talk to you later.